to the last train ride. It was a cold, damp evening when Rebecca found herself running late for the last train home. She had stayed late at work, finishing up a project that had taken more time than expected. By the time she reached the station, the platform was nearly deserted. The train she was catching, the final one of the night, was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful ride, something she was used to after long days in the office. As she stepped onto the train, she noticed the few other passengers scattered in their seats staring blankly out the windows. The lights flickered overhead, but she paid no mind, settling into a seat near the back. The train was eerily quiet, except for the gentle hum of the engine. Rebecca sat back, pulling out her phone to pass the time. It was just after midnight, and the last few stops would be hers. She hadn't seen many trains at this hour, so the silence was almost comforting. The world outside the train was pitch black except for the occasional streetlight flashing by. She briefly checked the time, just a few more stops before she'd be home. She couldn't explain why, but something felt off. A strange unease crept over her, like someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the few passengers scattered across the car and the odd flickering lights above. One man sitting across from her caught her gaze and smiled. Not a friendly, casual smile, but something unsettling. His lips stretched unnaturally wide, his eyes staring too intently, as if trying to pierce through her. Rebecca quickly looked away, focusing on her phone once more. Her heart began to race, but she told herself it was nothing. The man had probably noticed her looking and was just trying to make conversation. He didn't seem dangerous, just a little odd. She decided to let it go and ignore him. The train slowed at the next station, and the doors slid open with a hiss. 2 more passengers boarded, their footsteps heavy and deliberate as they shuffled down the aisle. Rebecca didn't pay them much attention, still feeling an odd chill creep up her spine. That was when she heard it. A low, unsettling noise, a quiet, almost imperceptible scratching sound, like nails against metal. Rebecca froze, her heart pounding as she looked around the train. The sound was coming from the walls, from somewhere deep within the structure. It was rhythmic, methodical. She felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. She glanced at the man across from her again. His smile had grown even wider, and his eyes glistened in the dim light. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the far end of the train, where the noise was coming from. His face was now twisted in anticipation. The scratching stopped. For a moment everything was still, but then the temperature inside the train seemed to drop, and Rebecca could see her breath misting in front of her. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the car. At first, Rebecca thought it was another passenger, but something was off about it. The figure moved with an unsettling fluidity, its body slightly hunched, as if something was wrong with its joints. It was wearing a long, dark coat, its face obscured by a hood. But there was something about its presence that made Rebecca's stomach churn. As the figure drew closer, the train car grew colder, and the lights flickered again, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Rebecca's eyes widened as the figure slowly raised its head. It wasn't human. The face that stared back at her was pale, almost translucent, with hollow black eyes that seemed to suck the light from the room. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling. The figure was no longer moving, standing perfectly still in the aisle, only a few feet away from her. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. The man across from her, who had once been smiling, was now looking directly at her, his face twisted in agony. He began to scream, but the sound was muted, like it was coming from underwater. His body trembled violently, his eyes wide with terror. As the figure in the aisle took a step closer, he suddenly went limp, his face frozen in an expression of horror. His body slumped forward, lifeless. Rebecca couldn't scream, she couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, her gaze locked on the figure as it drew nearer, its breath raspy and slow, like it was savoring the moment. And then, with a final deafening flicker of the lights, the train came to a screeching halt. Rebecca's heart stopped. She blinked, and the figure was gone. The train car was empty. The other passengers had vanished. The lights were back to normal. The warmth of the train returned, but the air still felt heavy, thick with an unnatural silence. The doors opened at her stop. She stumbled off the train, unable to look back, her mind racing, her body trembling. She didn't care if she was imagining it all. She needed to leave, to get away from that place. She never took that train again. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears the scratching sound, faint but persistent, echoing in her ears. And she knows. It's still out there, waiting for the next ride. The watcher in the window. Lena had always been drawn to the old house on the edge of town. It was a large Victorian with peeling paint, surrounded by overgrown hedges and wild vines that seemed to reclaim it bit by bit. For years, people whispered about it, saying it was haunted or that it had once belonged to a family who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But none of that ever stopped Lena from sneaking peeks at the house during her evening walks. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Lena passed by the house again. This time, though, something caught her eye. A light. A faint, flickering glow in one of the upstairs windows. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. The house had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there in at least a decade, and no one was supposed to be there now. Yet the light flickered again, then vanished, as though someone had turned it off. Curiosity gnawed at her. She told herself it was nothing. Perhaps the light had been from a passing car, or maybe it was just a trick of the setting sun. But as she continued walking, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next night, Lena decided to return. She waited until the streetlights flickered on, their orange glow casting eerie shadows over the sidewalk. She walked slowly, cautiously, to the house, the cold evening air making her breath visible in the darkness. This time, when she reached the front gate, she noticed something different. The door was ajar. It had never been opened before. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed it gently, wincing as it creaked on its rusty hinges. Inside, the house was frozen in time. Dust settled thickly on the furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners. The air smelled of mildew and neglect, but the silence was unnerving. No creaks, no distant footsteps, just the oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on her from all sides. She walked through the foyer, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As she ascended the stairs, Lena's heart began to race. The light from the upstairs window, the one she'd seen the night before, had drawn her in, but now a feeling of unease gripped her. The house was still, too still. When she reached the top of the stairs, she turned left, following the hallway toward the room where the light had appeared. The door was slightly cracked open. Her pulse quickened as she pushed it, her breath catching in her throat. The room was dim, but not empty. The faint glow she'd seen earlier now came from an old lamp on a side table. It flickered intermittently, casting long shadows against the walls. But it wasn't the lamp that made Lena's blood run cold. It was the figure standing in the corner. At first, Lena thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But no. There, in the farthest corner of the room, stood a person, a woman. She was facing the wall, her back to Lena, her hair long and disheveled, hanging in front of her face. Lena's throat tightened and her feet felt rooted to the floor. She opened her mouth to call out, but no sound came. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, but she couldn't move. The woman in the corner didn't move either, not even when Lena took a step closer. It wasn't until Lena was just a few feet away that she saw the woman's hands. They were pressed flat against the wall, the fingers bent unnaturally at the knuckles. And then with a slow, deliberate motion, the woman turned her head. Lena's heart stopped. The face was pale, almost gray, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into her soul. The skin around her mouth was stretched thin, as though the woman hadn't smiled in years. But the most terrifying part was the way her lips curled upward, slowly, as if she was savoring the moment. Lena wanted to scream, to run, but the woman's gaze held her in place. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping as the woman stepped toward her, dragging her feet along the floor in a strange, jerky motion. Lena finally found her voice. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. Instead, her mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and a low, rasping sound echoed through the room. The floor beneath Lena seemed to tremble, the shadows shifting unnaturally. Suddenly, the woman lunged forward, her mouth snapping open like a trap. Lena stumbled back, tripping over her own feet as she turned to run. She didn't stop until she was out of the house, gasping for breath. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Lena spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but when she looked up at the window where the light had been, there was nothing. The house was dark once again, lifeless. She stumbled away from the house, not daring to look back. But from that night on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Sometimes, when she was walking home, she thought she could see a figure in the upstairs window, waiting, watching. The pale face, the unnatural smile, all of it. Lena never went near the house again, but she still sees the face in the window. And she knows deep down that it's waiting for her to return. The whispering shadows. Sarah had never believed in ghosts. She had always dismissed the stories her grandmother told her about the old house on Willow Street as just that. Stories. A child's fantasy meant to thrill or frighten. But when her grandmother passed away, Sarah inherited the house, and with it a strange feeling she couldn't quite explain. The house was old, dating back to the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and faded wallpaper. It had been left untouched for years. Sarah had visited it a few times as a child, but now it was hers. It seemed like a perfect project, something to restore and make her own. She moved in, her belongings filling the empty rooms, and at first everything felt fine. But soon things began to change. The first night it was just a whisper, a soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. Sarah dismissed it as the house settling, the wind howling through cracks in the windows. But it wasn't the wind. Each night after that, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until Sarah could make out words. But they weren't words anyone should hear. They were soft, pleading, desperate. Help. Get out. Don't stay. One night, as the whispering grew louder, Sarah decided to investigate. She walked through the darkened hallways, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, searching for the source. The air was thick with an unnatural chill. She felt something like a presence following her, watching her every step. As she passed the old mirror in the hallway, she froze. Her reflection was not her own. For a brief moment, she saw a figure standing behind her, a shadow tall and thin, its features blurred as though the mirror itself was distorting its image. Sarah gasped and spun around, but the hallway was empty. Her heart pounded in her chest. She quickly turned away from the mirror and rushed upstairs. That's when she heard it, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor above her. No one was upstairs. Frozen in place, she listened as the footsteps moved toward the staircase. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the shadow under the door of the attic. It was large, long, and it moved back and forth, as if someone, or something, was pacing in the room. Sarah didn't want to go up there. The attic door was old, heavy, and covered in layers of dust. But something inside her told her she had to. With shaking hands, she reached for the door handle, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The moment she opened the door, the whispers stopped. Everything went silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, thick and suffocating. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The attic was small, cluttered with forgotten relics, old furniture, cardboard boxes filled with yellowed papers, and piles of discarded clothes. It looked abandoned, as if nothing had been touched in decades. But in the far corner of the room, something caught her eye, a large, dark shadow. As she approached, her pulse racing, she realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, crouched in the corner, its face obscured by matted hair. The figure was motionless, eerily still, and then it moved. The figure jerked its head up sharply, its eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural light. Its face, twisted, contorted with an expression of rage and pain, stared at Sarah. Its mouth opened wide in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The figure lunged toward her, its arms outstretched, fingers curling like claws. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The figure disappeared into the shadows before her eyes. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind her. Her heart was racing, her body trembling with fear. But the worst part wasn't the figure. It wasn't the whispering shadows. It was the realization that the house hadn't been empty when her grandmother passed away. The figure, the one in the attic, hadn't been alone. There were others, watching from the corners of the room, hiding in the darkness. She could feel them now, their eyes on her, always watching. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, trying to block out the whispers that grew louder and louder with every passing minute, she realized she couldn't escape. No matter how far she went, no matter how many rooms she locked, they were always there. The shadows would never leave, and neither would she. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed others before her. And in the dead of night, when the house was still and the shadows grew long, Sarah could hear them. The voices of those who had come before, whispering in the darkness, waiting for the next to join them.